Professor Dr. Kokunre Eghafona is Professor of Anthropology at the Department of Sociologie and Anthropologie of the University of Benin. Furthermore, she is a principal investigator of the Digital Benin project and an academician at the Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences at the Vatican. How many people can say about themselves to have met the Pope twice? You have. In her doctoral thesis, Curating Benin Cultural Materials Towards Integrating Indigenous and Orthodox Methods, she investigates what she calls the indigenous curatorial, conservation, and exhibition practices of the Benin people during the pre-colonial era, drawing out similarities with contemporary museum practices. Since then, she has published extensively on this and other topics concerning Benin culture and tradition. Dear Koki, in your work you propose that the presentation of Benin objects in static glass displays alienates the objects from their original presentation. You furthermore argue that these presentations are therefore less appealing to Nigerian visitors. We are very happy to have you here today, and we are very eager to hear your visions for sensitive museum exhibitions in the future. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Oh, okay. So good afternoon, everybody, and greetings from Benin City, Nigeria. Thanks to the director, Verona, and Marie Giti, or like we say back home, let me stand on the existing protocol already laid by Annie Combs. So I'm delighted to be here. I just want to talk about the research I've been doing for a number of decades, and also I would like to hear your comments about it. Something that struck me was, if I had been to the gallery before writing up my paper, I'm sure I would have added something a little different. So without wasting time, I want to start off with talking about cultural universals, and that every group of people, they make their objects. But the most important thing is that cultural objects are symbols of identity, and that people from varied cultures, they have ways they prefer to relate to their cultural objects. Different groups of people worldwide, they produce artifacts, usually in synchronization with their environment. And let's add that in a different environment, in a different context, environment, and situation, an object of one culture becomes sterile, empty, and just a work of art. Let me give myself as an example. I may not be a work of art, but I can't wear this in the streets of Berlin day in, day out. But then back home, it's comfortable for me to dress like this. So, and still talking about objects as a cultural universal phenomena, many of the cultural objects now seen as art pieces played more functional roles than mere art pieces to the makers, using Benin as an example. And Anda in 1988 said, through the ages, African art was hardly ever solely aesthetic in conception and purpose, but rather variously combined ritual, magical, religious, commemorative, and utilitarian functions. Now, Benin's peculiarity is tied up with the craft guild system. We know over the years the craft guild system, it's the craft guilds, the guilds in general. We had over 68 guilds, and they produced, apart from the craft guilds, about 12 to 14. The others, they produced whatever they were, their work was for, to the Oba. But then, the craft guilds, they were solely meant for the Oba, even though they produced for others with permission from the Oba. So under the Benin Guild system, various professionals and craftsmen were organized under royal patronage to produce, standardize, and market their products under monopoly rules. And the guilds, they remained a formal institution till the fall of Benin in the 19th century, 1897 to be precise. And it's said to be one of the longest surviving institutions in the Benin Kingdom, with a longer history than the present dynasty. Yes, it was set up in the previous dynasty before the present one. And it has indeed helped in the production of, how do we put that off? Yeah, it's not showing here.
Oh,
Yeah,
don't
it's
see
not.
this here.
And meanwhile, please permit me to acknowledge my colleagues at the Institute of Benin Studies. They are online. One of my mentees and graduate student, Edith Soke Eidame, she's also online. So, talking about the guild system, the guild system was highly organized, and they produced most of all the things that are all over the museums worldwide now. But it was well organized. What drew my attention to the research I conducted was that part of the organized system, Philip J.C. Dark claimed that Arrow E. Bradbury, Richard Bradbury, who had done a lot of ethnographic work in Benin, informed him that much of the loot removed from Benin in 1897 was in a good state of preservation, showing that care had been taken of it, and there were people in the palace whose job it was to look after its treasures. That sets me to think. In other words, these people, over the years, these objects have been produced, so they have a way of caring for these objects, probably exhibiting these objects, and using them for educational purposes. That is why it can pass on from father to son, and they can use it for historical purposes. So in looking after these treasures, there must have also been a system to arrange and display them, which we may equate to what is known as exhibitions in modern museums today. Another thing that actually drew my attention to doing my research, talking about colonial Nigeria and the introduction of the formal museum institution, and a lot of institutions came in. For example, the Western-style educational institution was introduced during the colonial era. Many of the indigenous institutions gave way to the Western way of life. It wasn't that we were not educating our children. We had our own informal way of educating them in different ways of life. Whoever is going to be a farmer, for example, the craft guilds, whoever is going to be a brass caster, a carver, they had these institutions laid down. But good, we now had the Western system of education. When the formal institution of museums were established in Nigeria, the Nigerian museums automatically adopted the conventional style of exhibition of objects. That is why you see the British Museum, you can look at the gallery, and at the same time the museum in Benin, there's nothing spectacular or different to tell you that, oh, this is the Benin Museum. And unfortunately, I found out that the indigenes are not interested, majority of them are not interested in visiting the museums. In the year 2000, I conducted a survey to find out about the audience that visited the museum. And the total, I had 8,557 visitors to the museum in year 2000. Out of it, good, we had Nigerians 7,847. But out of that 7,000, 4,691 were students. And it was mandatory for them to visit the museums. Good. Others were adults. Then we had foreigners. 11 years later, okay, immediately after year 2020, year 2000, I started a television program called The Museum and the Public. I wanted the public to know more about the museum, the things in the museum, how they can relate to the museum, and at the same time, too, when they were visiting the museum, I was also giving out questionnaires to my students back at the university and to some communities. What is your interest, and how can we improve the museum? How can we bring the museum closer to you? I think the audience increased a bit. 11 years later, total number of people, 11,000. 456, out of which 962 compulsory school visits. We had only adults 1,729. 2023, that's just last year, the number dropped to 10,000 people, of which 8,190 were student visitors. Foreigners, 273 because of insecurity. So in 2023, there are no marked differences in the space of 23 years. The visitors' numbers were even lower than the year 2011. Foreign visits reduced, likely due to some insecurity in the country. So the summary of it all, like I say, museums are seen as foreign institutions, and the Benin Museum, is not frequently visited by the indigenes. I cannot say that about the Lagos Museum because, Lagos is a busy area. But then, the Benin Museum, in spite of all the things on exhibits, Vorame's photograph, and how we enlarged, we saw that in Stefan's your presentation. So the particular gallery, people were not interested. But like I can say, for the past number of decades, I've been working on Benin like a longitudinal research, and basically I use 3 forms of survey tools: key informant interviews. Over the years, I have been meeting with custodians of Benin culture and tradition. Many of them are gone now, but those who probably experienced, they were young children in 1897, I was able to interview a lot of them concerning the Benin objects, how they were used in the past. So, and I conducted a lot of key informant interviews with the chiefs, Benin chiefs, then also to focus group discussions with the brasscasters and the carvers and the craftsmen. Also in the communities. I visited the communities because some of these communities were still producing some of these objects. And, they look at the museum like an elitist institution, and they dare not move close to that museum. And I tell them, it belongs to you. It belongs to us. The objects there belong I saw something there that it belongs to all of us, yes. And then I used to interview them. What would you like to see? How would you bring the museum closer to you? And apart from that, my students back at the university, some questionnaires. I administered questionnaires to find out about their attitude towards the museum, what they would like to see in the museum. Also, too, far back as some 15 years ago, I started asking them, would you like to have these objects back? And to tell you the truth, over the years, we've been having interesting results. Now, let me mention a bit about Benin's kingdom's display of objects in their traditional structure. Because, like we'll say, that to have a good method of exhibiting ethnographic and anthropological material, situate them as much as possible within the social and cultural context in which they function. You can't just leave them just like that without any relating to their background. So rather than displaying the Benin bronzes as objects of art and admiration, you go there, you say, wow. No, it may be more instructive to provide a detailed understanding of the parts they played in the society that produced them. That was why I was so glad when I got to the gallery and I had the voices of people talking about the Benin cultural objects and rendering songs, which I would have loved to see back home in my museum. So moving on, there is a need for an African-oriented museum. That was not my idea, but some African museum curators mentioned that to suit the taste and needs of Africans. An African-oriented museum might help in resolving some of the problems plaguing the museums in West Africa, where people do not visit. The World Museum may be alien to the Benin vocabulary, but I assure you that we had ways in which our objects were kept in places that are like museums now. So people, like I said, people had institutions and structures to care and display for those objects. And if this did not exist, we wouldn't have been able to get the number of objects that are in the museums worldwide now. And during the pre-colonial era, the Obas had separate altars housed in walled compounds known as uga. And they were seen during the British invasion in 1897. That is where they collected all the ivory tusk and the bronze heads and different things they amassed. So many of these objects, like we all know, were used in recording historical events as well as religious observances in the past. They ended up in the museum as objects and contributed considerably to global understanding of Benin culture. Many of the bronzes and other items, now viewed as art by museum curators, they were actually mnemonic devices or pictorial writing that aided the recollection of ancestors and events in the Benin history. I went on and on about the plaque and gave the example. Good. Now that we could read and write and record things, when Queen Elizabeth visited Benin in 1956, you can see the photograph there, but at the same time, a bronze caster had that done. So it tells us this is what used to happen in the past. We didn't have the photograph, but then the bronze work. And then Phil Omodame, we'll be talking about Phil Omodame. Phil Omodame did that carving. So that was what the plaque was. Most times, rather than we didn't have the camera to take photographs, when an event was happening in the palace, the bronze casters came and recorded them in bronze, in ivory, and so forth. So the regular static show glass display in museums, they don't appeal to us. In fact, when you talk to some of the elder in the past, they'll say, why lock them up in glass? What did the objects do? So, and to counteract the lack of interest and other similar problems faced in general by West African museums, it's essential to create alternative ways of presenting the museum to the African public. Arinze in Decca 1990 said, in the African Museum as conceived by the Europeans and Americans, there is no context, no interest. A lot of people who come to museums don't because, who would come to the museums don't because it doesn't mean anything to them. An ideal museum, one that would tell an African story, that will have its main focus on African problems, using things on the continent so that the average people from the rural areas will want to come in. There would be objects, but they would be used in a totally different way. Not just that they are art, but that they have a function. The approaches that have been adopted in some of our museums are basically static. We need to talk to the people, and that is what I had been doing, talking to the people, especially in the rural areas. So the predictable museum show glass display has never offered attraction to the local populace, but rather gave the museum, especially the Benin Museum, in that case, that's where I've been solely working with the Benin Museum, an elitist look for the very few who can afford the time and leisure to visit the museums. Now, talking about indigenous exhibition and display of Benin museums, we didn't have exhibition. To tell you the truth, there was no exhibition for general public viewing. It didn't exist in the past. Those objects were just kept there, over the years. Objects of any form were not deliberately exhibited or locked up in show glasses in the case. Ancestral altars and shrines were not intended for any kind of audience that the modern-day museum catered for, but solely for initiated persons. The palace had a large collection of various types of shrines and altars containing objects, but these were not accessible to the public for pleasure viewing at any time, because most of them also had their altars back home, their ancestral altars, especially the firstborn children in Benin, because of the law of primogeniture. So the palace altars are, I still use a present word, are semicircular mud platforms with smooth edges. Most palace altars were located in an open courtyard called Otegodo. Similar altars existed in houses of chiefs, especially those dedicated to or erected in memory of ancestors. So individual people too also had collection of objects from the past. These altars are to be maintained from generation to generation. They are inheritances that were passed from father to son, and they were never split into parts or shared. New objects were made when the previous owner died and a new owner takes over. It's described as having kind of like a private museum. So it was not static. New objects were always being added. New owners added important items to the altar. In a way, these objects were exhibited privately to those who owned them, their families and visitors. Altars outside the royal family, usually rectangular mud platform, as distinct from the royal altar, that are semi-secular. So, talking about how they displayed these objects in the past, in the arrangement of some of these objects, certain order had to be adhered to. From time past, pre-colonial Benin traditional setting, they were based on the arrangement of individualized objects. They never mixed objects together. You do not put the head of King Obaewakbe or Obaewakbe statue, put it with Oba Kenzwa, or except when they are carved on ivory toques and they are telling a story. But then each altar had the objects meant for a particular king. In the royal altar, if one ancestor's figurine or bust is exhibited in a particular space, everything else related to him will be kept around this figure. Such in the family altar too. So the ideal display distinguished one set of objects from another in chronological order, using the period in which the ancestor now represented lived, and in the palace, the arrangement according to the reigns of the kings. This has been described, one of my key informants described it as when they planted yams. They planted yams and crops in a row, and spaces were measured in between. And in between these spaces, sets of objects that were usual, there was an order to arranging this. And like they told me in the local parlance, there was a sort of rhythm and rhyme. Important altars and collection of objects were always in front, while others followed according to their importance. The carved staves, which we call uhure, usually at the back, behind the objects, leaning behind the shrine and altar. Single objects are probably properly displayed to reflect their importance and sacredness, for each one has its scale of value and importance. Related objects, they go together, and they were not just used for decoration. Wooden, ivory, or brass objects were all arranged according to their usage: palace, ceremonial, religious, chieftaincy, initiation into priesthood. So all objects in a given space must be functionally related to one another, and on and on and on. And I had opportunity to interview a daughter of Oba Eweka, that's Ovorame's son, and she described the way her father arranged his Orumila trays impressed in the mud walls. Regular spacing she observed, talked about the arrangement of the brass bust, which we have mentioned earlier on. And then male and female figurine were not just identified, but also objects of gender differentiation, like I will show you. They were placed in respective shrines. For example, the rooster we know, I saw a number of roosters in our the storage. The rooster represents the Queen Mother. It's placed by her figurine and all other paraphernalia. Custodians of these collections, they knew about these objects and how they were arranged, and they educated those who were also in their guild. This is how to arrange these objects. This is how to relate to these objects, and this is the meaning of such objects. The exhibited items, they tell stories, relate events that these custodians can easily narrate by merely looking at the display. In essence, objects were thus traditionally displayed. It was a taboo and sacrilegious act to steal them. Nowadays, unfortunately, sometimes in our museums, they steal the objects. They are no longer afraid. But then, in the past, they dare not touch any of these objects. Other items that were not in use, they were kept in safe places, such as rooms set aside for storage. So just as we have a storage area in the museum, they also had their traditional storage area. I have these two photographs, an altar dedicated to Agbontaen-Eghafona, 1888 to 1914, and it was probably erected after he was taken away to Calabar, and his son, Obaeweka II, did that. And in the same, there was this photograph, which I think I also saw in the museum, taken in May 1891, definitely Oba Adolo, that's Oba Ovoramen's father, also displayed. And as you can see how they were displayed, the tusk, the bells, even though it's not very clear, the bells are usually in front. Now, talking about incorporating the indigenous and conventional methods of exhibition, that was part of my work. I felt, why don't we find a midway, the way we were doing it before? And in general, of course, I have seen what has been done in the museum here, impressive innovations. So definitely, we should still hold on to the new ideas that our curators have. But a combination of the Benin traditional method and orthodox methods of museum exhibition, they may serve the needs of the visitors back home in Benin. For this, my work, I just want to address briefly the museum in Benin and the museums in the Western world. So, for the way the objects are arranged, suggestions can be made on how we can also contribute to exhibitions in where Benin objects are kept. Like I stressed, it's also essential that exhibition relates to the local scene of the objects. That's why I was so impressed when I heard the singing. In fact, I sat in that gallery for a long time and I was relaxed. I felt if this was done back home in Benin, you hear the song being sung, people would be attracted to come more to the museum. So, as much as possible, the display of objects should reflect its daily ritual function and significance. The basic information from the past it should be represented as much as possible. Benin objects were never kept alone, be it a plaque or a memorial head. They were combined with other objects that told a story. But I guess when we have that, we can have it in the label and it will tell us that. And there are so many innovative ways now that people read a lot about what's in the museum. In museum exhibition design, rather than a single showcase case glass display, a number of related objects that tell a similar story can be grouped in a particular space, which I saw yesterday. That is how the rhyme and the rhythm were obtained in the past, especially with objects that were displayed in the ancestral altars. And on and on and on, I described how some objects were kept. Of much interest, exhibitions should be brought to life as much as possible. It's a living museum, not a dead museum that you go in year after year in, year out. For example, in year 2000, some of the little children that visited the museum, by year 2023, they were grown up. I don't think they ever went back to the museum except when they went for that tour. So the museum should be a living museum, and the way the objects can be brought into to life. So when a main museum object is a center of attraction in a showcase, miniature objects can be added to tell the story of the main objects. Just like when you showed your Ewakbe altar, with the male slave, the female slave, and all other things, to tell a story, not just looking at an object. Even if it's a bust, at least you know this belongs to Oba, this particular Oba. Also, too, sound effects in the museum should be emphasized. Echoes or sounds of the local particular scene, a village, a market, holding court in the palace, people singing. It will contribute to making the object a stamped mark of its place of origin. Sound effects can remind us of where we are viewing that object and from the cultural area of the ethnic group from which the object comes from. This was at the Pitt Rivers Museum, Oxford. And I was interested when I saw this, just like, the walls in the palace, we have lines. So they tried as much as possible to bring this like an altar, even though I felt it was overcrowded. Moving on, Queen Mother's mask on exhibition. I visited the British Museum and I saw the head of Queen Idia we have been looking for since 1977. Good, locked up. But then I want to mention something. We may have this ivory hip mask in several museums. It is not always the head of Queen Idia. If you look, other queen mothers had such hip mask done for them. So talking about the queen mother's mask on exhibition, the Idia mask, for example, was placed at the ancestral shrine of the Iyoba, that's the queen mother. Similar to an Oba's altar, the Iyoba had an altar erected on her behalf, which consists of objects reflecting her lifetime, such as the commemorative head of the Queen Mother. They were all placed at the ancestral shrine. An altar is usually found in the Queen Mother's domain outside Benin, in a place where we call, it's within Benin City now, but then in those days it was a little bit outside Benin. So it was Oba Esigye that introduced the role of Yoba because the mother went to war with him. And then, not only that, there's usually a saying, a song concerning her. So, most times when these objects are displayed, it is good to also have this narrative along with it. Now, moving on, talking about, I want to focus more now on the museums that are not the National Museum in Benin, or also to be the National Museum in Nigeria. The use of language in the exhibition of Benin objects. I found this article by Chao Tayana, 2022, very interesting in addressing the digital Benin platform on the use of derogatory, racist, and harmful languages. And she cautioned that we should avoid terminologies and terms for labeling some particular collections in the museum. Many museums and catalogs in the past have adopted terms from the colonial era. Some of these terms are harmful and prejudiced towards source communities. Good, I saw one of them downstairs, but I saw that it was not reproduced. The derogatory language was not reproduced. So, and Tayana proposes an ethical, equitable, and transparent reading of the artworks and artifacts. And the impact of language and tone is said to be central to the user's experience and should be examined, as most colonial catalogs did not adequately represent the ephemeral, spiritual, and historical qualities of the indigenous materials being displayed. Gibson in 2016, the example from the Zulu community, where collections are seen by the community, they depart significantly from existing museum description. So, in the use of language, we should be aware of knowledge controls. Such questions: what was said? How and why it was said? What is the intention of the word? What message do they convey, both about the objects and the people who created them? Whose knowledge is valued and recorded, and whose is erased and disdained? So, quoting Tayana, an epistemic framework in which people are only identified by race, ethnic group, and in which their rich and complex cultural context can only be viewed as lesser primitive forms, lies at the heart of language use within the museum collections. And I give you an example. I was looking through a catalog. Some of this was primitive. It's good. I mean, I can see it's no longer used as in the past, because I actually worked at in the this gallery at the Met, the African Gallery. It used to be called the primitive art. Primitive, the word is derogatory, offensive, as well as insulting. It's advisable to use the word indigenous. When we have to use previous citations, including those words, viewers and museum audience should be informed that they are derogatory. Juju, fetish, Negro, tribe, medicine man, native doctor, they are racist terms, or Black Africa. Now, in this catalog, figure 32, they said, the altar furniture includes the fetish talks with their bronze pedestal and altar bells and rattle staves. Also, too, called from Great Benin Royal Art, I think in Pennsylvania Museum, The caption further read, "The juju of fetish altar, which has lately been installed in the African room, is designed to blah, 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 from that formerly powerful Negro kingdom." And let me tell you something. At the beginning of last century, when a number of Benin people were being converted to become Christians, and they had some of these objects, they were told, this is juju, and you saw them, iconoclasm, going to throw them away in the streams, in the rivers. They didn't want to be associated with these objects. So because they were called juju, again, reading on, the king's power was fetish. So other examples marked Negro features. Here, the word Negro is used directly in reference to racial stereotype and description of persons. Then the head of bronzes with Negro features. Here, the word is used in direct reference to racial stereotypes. Again, the word tribe. The word tribe. Kind of tribe promotes a myth of primitive African timelessness, obscuring history and change, associated with primitiveness. So instead of the word tribe, we should use ethnic group or nationalities. So the original captions found in some old European or American catalogs, they should not be reproduced again. But then, for historical purposes, if we need to reproduce them, explain to enlighten and educate the audience that they are derogatory terms. This should be what should be done in museum back home as well as over here. Whereas in Benin, Benin structures of traditional altar display, the language used is full of eulogy, memory recollection of greatness of their ancestors, singing songs, displays, and praises. So, aftermath of survey, like I said, I kept on going to conduct the questionnaires, especially from the university setting. And I realized that we need a need for more education and awareness raising. Talking about restitution, part of it, like mentioned by the director, collaboration. So there's need for more education and awareness raising, planned publicity about how the museum can reach the masses. In talking about education and exhibition, local community involvement and active partnership with the museums. We cannot leave out the local community, the rural areas. There is need to involve support of communities, religious leaders, and stakeholders. We should encourage community museums, exhibitions where indigenes, they can showcase their products at the local government setting, state, national, and even international audience. Also, we can use electronic technology. We used to have what we call the Benin Museum Kitchen. I suggested back home it should be revitalized. And it used to offer cookery courses and then meals, healthy and sumptuous Nigerian delicacies for sale. We should also inspire contemporary Benin craftsmen and their descendants who produce the cultural objects. Craftsmen should be recognized to produce copies from the original to assist with tourism potential. So in conclusion, museum exhibition should entertain while teaching and educating, especially back home. One way to achieve this is by altering the orthodox concept of museum exhibitions to incorporate the background culture of the object on display. Even though these exhibitions are put together after research with scholarly background, like I saw yesterday, back home it doesn't have to be dull for the indigenes. Museums, especially in places where they are not appreciated, should be made a place of enlightenment, stimulation, amusement, and instruction to visit. So despite the universal principles of museum exhibition, designers should emphasize the local scene while planning installation. This may help to bring the museum, it may help to bring the museum closer to the people and offer more interesting and educative experience to people of other cultures. So I end my slide by saying, Oba talk be. We say, it's long may you live, our Oba. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Koki, for your presentation and for the insights that you gave us into the practices of exhibiting in Benin. It seems to be a topic that's often forgotten in European contexts.
Pardon?
It seems to be somehow forgotten in European contexts a lot.
Yeah.
All right, I will open for questions now. Any questions from the room? Oh yeah, a lot.
Okay.
You want to start?
Thank you very much for this very informative and inspirational, in some ways, conversation. I want to ask, what do you think of the impact of Bernard Fagg and Bill Fagg in their creation of this whole culture of museums in Brazil in the name of kind of their colonial mission?
In Brazil?
I'm not sorry, Nigeria.
In Benin?
I'm jet lagged,
In
okay?
Benin. Oh, okay. Thank you. So Bernard Fagg and William Fagg, as well as Kenneth Murray, it was a good thing. It was a good thing that they brought the idea of the museum. Even one of the Benin historians, foremost historians, Jacob Igareva, was actually the first curator there at the museum. It was a good thing to gather, especially this was an era where there was a lot of iconoclasm. People were throwing away their objects. It was a good thing to get them together and for us to have the museum. It's a universal institution. So Bernard Fagg and William Fagg, it was a good thing they did. I think one of them now became the curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum or so. I can't remember.
Well,
But then they were in Benin.
Bill Fagg had positions at the British Museum, at the several museums in New York, and at the University of Pennsylvania Museum as
Yes.
well. I mean, sometimes all together, but sometimes as kind of partial
All right.
positions in different places.
Thank you. The only aspect was he was worried that some of these objects back home were being looted away. Even though they were buying them, the government may have bought them back, especially some that were taken away in 1897, but that our museums were porous. He was actually worried. But then they and the rest of them, they assisted in bringing the museum, the formal museum institution to Nigeria, 1943. Thank you.
Thank
There's
you,
somebody
Koki.
there.
I think we have one question from the digital realm, and then we wanted to.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Verena.
There's again one question from. Oh, no, she's
Sorry.
gone.
I'm here.
Ah, yeah, okay, you're already there. Excellent. Please go
Yeah.
ahead.
And apologies for all the questions. This has just been such a fascinating conference. So my mind is buzzing with ideas. And thank you so much for this talk today. It was so good to sort of get this perspective on, the potential for the Benin bronzes in a way that is not sort of your typical sort of Western construct of a museum. I was just wondering if, so not related to Benin in particular, but I know in Nigeria just recently from last year, there was a center established, the John Randall Center for Yoruba Culture and History in Lagos. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on their approach to dealing with cultural heritage in a way that's more community-centered, and whether you think that might also have a scope for, interpretation of the Benin bronzes in Benin with regards to showing or facilitating detailed understanding of the part that the bronzes played in the society that produced them. Thank you.
Oh, it's a pity I haven't heard much about that institution in Lagos. Please, can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yes, so I mean, unfortunately,
In
I haven't
Lagos.
been there myself. Yes, it's in Lagos. My understanding is that it was sort of built from the ground up as a way to, I guess, teach Yoruba people about Yoruba culture, where they might not otherwise get access to, the intangible cultural heritage of the people. Yes.
All right, good. Of course, that is also a good example for Benin. And from that example in Lagos, it's something that should be incorporated in Benin too, because from the survey I have conducted, a number of our children, they are not that they are not in tune with these objects produced by their ancestors, but it is good for them to know more about it and not to look at them like, they were, I don't want to use the word fetish, but then these were objects that were used in commemorating events and recording history. Thank you. Thank you. And when I go back to Lagos, I'll find out more about that. Thank you.
Oh, lovely.
Yes.
I'm glad to have helped in some way. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, there was another question over here, I think.
There was a question, something about Harlem. I read something.
Yeah.
Let's do one more from the room here and then the digital one.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I loved this quote about that somebody said to you about, oh, why are they all imprisoned in glass? So what did they do? And I just wondered whether, what your thoughts were about touching the objects and those relationships with visitors, whether they could rearrange them and things, whether, that's part of what you're thinking about.
I don't believe they should touch the objects, but when replicas are made and they know these replicas are available for sale in the museum shop, they can have them, touch them in their homes, hang them up. I have a number of these cultural objects back home, and I can relate to them. But the ones in the museum, they shouldn't wear them out with. Yes. There was an online question.
Yeah, I think it's more of a, there is a
Comments.
question, commentary and a
good.
question. So Dedria Farmer-Palman writes, very helpful and informative. We are now planning a Benin Kingdom Museum in Harlem, New York. Understanding of altars and relics placement is critical. Considering the destruction of the kingdom during the punitive expedition in 1897, what is the source of this information? How was it retained or obtained?
Okay, I conducted a lot of interviews from the custodians of Benin tradition over the years, since in 1980s. I used to ask them, how were these objects displayed? Some were chiefs in the palace, some were children of the previous kings, and they had ideas. And those who actually saw some of these altars, and they told me, this is how these objects are displayed. You don't just throw them anyhow. They have an order in which they're displayed. Yes. Thank you. I hope that answered. Through interviews, I conducted a lot of interviews. Yes.
Thank you so much for your intriguing presentation. I was wondering, I do research in Dakar with a lot of artists and curators, and there is much going on about rethinking the museum and transforming the museum when objects coming back, or even for contemporary art. And it reminded me much of that what you have been said, that the museum is such a foreign space, and that they are, much of them, very radical to say, okay, we have to put the arts on the street and don't have even museums anymore, to really be connected with the community and engage and have like a more vital and more connected to life in general. So what you think about that?
That's a good idea, and I've always suggested that at the Benin Museum. Let the descendants of some of these people who produce this work, let them have an open display. People will come in. Somehow, they are scared of the museum. The museum, for those who have been in Benin, it's in a big roundabout. If you do not have a vehicle, you cannot access the museum. So, if you invite the people to display, a cultural display, most times festivals, we still perform these festivals year in, year out. And if these festivals are done in the museum, it brings the people closer to the museum, and they will identify the museum belongs to us. It doesn't belong to some foreigners. Thank you. Yeah.
Is there another question online? I don't think so. Okay.
Oh,
Then Marianne's next.
Thank you very much. I have a question connecting to the two other questions. Because
Yes.
actually, why should the people go to the museum? I think the museum should go to the people.
Oh, okay,
so,
yeah.
I mean, if the festivals are still performed,
Yes.
they normally not perform in front of the museum. They perform wherever the people are. So this is the idea. What should the people be imprisoned? The entities be in prison. So they should actually go where the
yes.
people are celebrating their festival or celebrating whatever they want to celebrate, so that it really re-socialize, so to say, the entities that have been kept in prison.
Thank you. In fact, I think I mentioned that. It's true, the museum should go to the people, but also too, the people, where the information, how will it get to others in the community? How will it get to the others in Benin City? It's the museum that will announce we are having such a festival with this group of people. Not just good, it's a good idea. I also suggested it. The museum should go to the people, and the people should also go to the museum.
The entities be kept in the museum. What should they be kept in the society? Where they belong to?
Because of the value, we have to keep them in the museum. But then, there's a large space. There's a large space for many of these festivals. It is a good idea that the museum should go to the people. Good. But also, too, the people should visit the museum. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for this wonderful and very inspiring presentation. Just to follow up on Marianne and also the question before that, the entities going to the people. I think you've mentioned it somewhere in your presentation that there is an idea about traveling exhibitions, or let's say representatives of the entities visiting communities. Or could you maybe elaborate a little bit about that? That would be very interesting.
All right. Oh, okay. Yeah, the craftsmen, especially the brass casters, they still exist in Benin, Igun Street. I'm sure a number of my colleagues visited Igun Street. And sometimes they produce for some shops. But then I suggested that the museum should work along with them, reproduce these old objects, some that were taken away, and like Phil Omadame is doing. Not just reproducing the old ones, contemporary artists too, they can find their place also too in the Benin, with the Benin cultural objects. So that's why we also need to encourage the craftsmen to produce. So if you are interested in a particular one, you can always have it, even though it's not dated to 16th, 17th century, but then it's a replica. Thank you.
Is there another question either in the room? I've seen one. Is there another one in the digital room? All right, then I'd say we close with your question.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. It was fantastic. Kind of the reason why I came here for. Thanks so much. More than a question, I have an open reflection because I'm a independent curator and I research on curatorial dreaming as a form of engaged critical heritage practice, because sometimes when we are using the words critical heritage, decoloniality, deconstructing, we are basing ourselves on current regulation that also follows very specific colonial parameters still, no? So legality is not necessarily a pillow for dreams. And yes, so I would like to ask you, like, thinking about curatorial dreaming still as a category that reconciles analysis and hope, which which I think is a political project. What would be your dream for your museum?
Oh, my dream for my museum, where I see many of the indigenes coming and to visit the museum, where I see a lot of sound, a lot of sights, and where festivals are performed, and when these objects are brought back, objects that are going to be brought back, and how they will be, our curators will properly label them to relate to the people, a whole history of that particular period. For example, if it is the rooster, that particular rooster, who owns it? I want proper identification of this object, not just, oh, Queen Mother's head. Who is this Queen Mother? Somehow, the local artists, they seem to know. When you give them these objects, they are able to identify them. So I would want to see more of these objects in our museums properly identified and properly labeled, that people will go there and learn a lot about their history. So that's my dream, with lots of sound and sights. Thank you very much.